What if I told you that the anxiety you've been fighting against for years isn't actually the problem? That every self-help book, every breathing exercise, every therapy session might have been addressing a symptom while missing the fundamental cause entirely. 2,500 years ago, a man sitting under a tree discovered something about the human mind that modern psychology is only beginning to understand, and this single insight has the power to completely transform your relationship with anxiety. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn might change everything you thought you knew about why you feel the way you feel. Let me start with a story. A few years ago, I was having a panic attack in a grocery store. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I abandoned my cart and rushed to my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe, trying to calm down, trying to make it stop. And that word, trying, is exactly where this story begins. Because according to Buddhist psychology, that desperate attempt to make the anxiety stop was actually making it worse. The Buddha taught something that sounds almost paradoxical at first. He said that our suffering doesn't come from our pain, it comes from our relationship with pain. Our anxiety isn't caused by the things we're anxious about, it's caused by how we respond to the feeling of anxiety itself. Now, before you click away thinking this is just some spiritual mumbo-jumbo, hear me out, because this isn't about chanting mantras or achieving enlightenment. This is about understanding a fundamental mechanism of your mind that operates whether you believe in Buddhism or not, whether you meditate or not, whether you consider yourself spiritual or not. The Buddha wasn't trying to create a religion when he sat under that Bodhi tree. He was investigating the nature of human suffering with the precision of a scientist, and what he discovered has been validated by modern neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and thousands of years of people finding relief from mental suffering. So what is this insight? The Buddha called it tanha, which is usually translated as craving or thirst, but I think the best way to understand it in the context of anxiety is as clinging. Specifically, he identified 3 types of clinging that create all human suffering. The first is clinging to pleasure, constantly chasing the next good feeling. The second is clinging to becoming, always trying to be someone different, someone better, someone more. And the third, the one most relevant to anxiety, is clinging to annihilation, the desperate attempt to make uncomfortable experiences disappear. Every moment you spend trying to push away your anxiety, trying to eliminate it, trying to make it stop, you're actually feeding it, strengthening it, giving it more power over your life. Think about it this way. Have you ever noticed that the more you try not to think about something, the more you think about it? If I tell you right now, don't think about a pink elephant, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Exactly. Your mind doesn't work through suppression, it works through attention. Whatever you give attention to grows stronger, and when you're anxious about being anxious, when you're scared of your own fear, you create what psychologists call a secondary anxiety loop. The original anxiety might have been triggered by something external, a presentation at work, a social situation, a health concern, but then you become anxious about the anxiety itself, and that secondary anxiety is often far more powerful and persistent than the original trigger. The Buddha observed this pattern 2,500 years ago without brain scans or laboratory experiments. He simply sat with his own mind and watched how it worked, and what he saw was that suffering has a structure, a pattern, a mechanism. He laid it out in what's called the second noble truth. The cause of suffering is craving, specifically the craving for things to be different than they are. When you're anxious, you want to not be anxious. When you're uncomfortable, you want to be comfortable. When something feels bad, you want it to feel good. And that wanting, that grasping, that resistance to what is, that's where the real suffering comes from. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like I'm saying you should just accept your anxiety and do nothing about it. That you should just be okay with feeling terrible. But that's not it at all. In fact, that interpretation itself is another form of clinging to the idea that you need to become someone who accepts everything. The Buddha's insight is far more subtle and far more practical than that. He's not saying don't take action to improve your life. He's saying that the quality of resistance, the emotional pushing away, the mental fighting, that's what creates the suffering. You can take action from a place of acceptance, from a place of clarity, from a place of non-resistance, And that action will be far more effective than action taken from a place of desperate avoidance. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you're feeling anxious about an upcoming job interview. The conventional approach, the one most of us have been taught, is to try to calm yourself down, to talk yourself out of the anxiety, to distract yourself, to use techniques to make the anxiety go away. And sometimes those techniques work temporarily, but often they don't, and when they don't work, you become anxious about the fact that you're still anxious, and now you're in that secondary loop. The Buddhist approach is completely different. Instead of trying to make the anxiety go away, you turn toward it. You feel the sensation in your chest, the tightness in your throat, the racing of your heart. You observe these sensations without judgment, without trying to change them, without telling yourself they shouldn't be there. You allow them to be exactly as they are. And here's what's fascinating. When you stop fighting the anxiety, when you stop adding that layer of resistance, the anxiety often naturally begins to decrease on its own. Not because you're trying to make it decrease, but because you've stopped feeding it with your resistance. It's like holding a beach ball underwater. As long as you're pushing it down, you have to exert constant effort and the pressure keeps building. The moment you stop pushing, the ball naturally rises to the surface and then just floats there, no longer requiring any effort from you. Your anxiety is the same way. The more you push against it, the more energy it takes and the more it pushes back. The moment you stop pushing, it loses its power. But let's go deeper, because the Buddha didn't stop at observing that clinging causes suffering. He asked the next logical question. Why do we cling? What causes this tendency to grasp and push away? And his answer reveals something profound about the nature of anxiety. We cling because we misunderstand the nature of reality. We think things are permanent when they're actually constantly changing. We think we have a fixed, solid self, when actually our experience is a flowing stream of sensations, thoughts, and emotions. And most importantly, we think that external circumstances are the cause of our internal experience, when actually it's our relationship to those circumstances that determines how we feel. This is huge when it comes to anxiety, because most of us believe our anxiety is caused by external things. We're anxious because of our job, because of our relationships, because of our health, because of the state of the world. And yes, those things can trigger anxiety. They can be catalysts, but they're not the root cause. The root cause is the mind's tendency to grasp at what it wants and push away what it doesn't want, combined with the fundamental misunderstanding that we can control reality through our mental resistance to it. You can't control whether you get the job, whether the person likes you, whether your health remains perfect, whether the world goes in the direction you want. But you've been living as if your anxiety, your worry, your mental spinning somehow gives you control over these uncontrollable things. Let me share something personal. For most of my 20s, I had chronic anxiety about the future. I would lie awake at night spinning scenarios, trying to plan for every possibility, trying to prevent bad things from happening through the sheer force of my worry. On some unconscious level, I believed that if I worried enough, I could control the outcome. If I anticipated every problem, I could prevent it. But the Buddha would say I had it exactly backwards. My worry wasn't protecting me, it was making me suffer in the present moment over things that might never happen. And even when some of those feared events did occur, the worry hadn't prepared me. It had just meant I suffered twice, once in anticipation and once in reality. The Buddhist texts describe this with a powerful metaphor. They say that believing your worry protects you is like picking up a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned. Every moment spent in anxious resistance to reality is a moment of self-inflicted suffering. And the cruel irony is that we do it thinking we're helping ourselves, thinking we're staying safe, thinking we're being responsible or prepared, but actually we're just burning ourselves with that hot coal over and over again. So what's the alternative? The Buddha laid out a path which he called the Noble Eightfold Path, but at its core, it's about learning to see reality clearly and to respond to it wisely, rather than reacting from a place of craving and aversion. In the context of anxiety, this means learning to distinguish between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. You're a human being with a nervous system that evolved to detect threats. Sometimes you will feel fear. Sometimes you will feel discomfort. Sometimes your body will have a stress response. That's pain. That's just part of being alive, and the Buddha never promised to eliminate pain. What he offered was the end of suffering, and suffering is what happens when you add resistance to pain, when you lay a judgment on top of discomfort, when you create stories about how wrong it is that you feel this way. Here's a practical exercise that comes directly from Buddhist psychology. The next time you feel anxious, try this. Don't try to make it go away. Don't distract yourself. Don't talk yourself out of it. Instead, get curious about it. Where do you feel it in your body? Is it in your chest, your stomach, your throat? What's the quality of the sensation? Is it tight, fluttery, heavy, buzzing? Does it stay constant, or does it change? Does it move or stay in one place? What happens if you breathe into that sensation? Not to make it go away, but just to explore it, to know it fully. And as you're doing this, notice your thoughts about the anxiety. Notice if there's a voice saying, "This is bad. I need to fix this. I can't handle this. What's wrong with me?" Just notice those thoughts as thoughts, not as truth, not as reality, but as mental events arising and passing away. This practice, which in Buddhism is called mindfulness or bare attention, does something remarkable. It breaks the automaticity of your reaction. For most of your life, the pattern has been anxiety arises, resistance arises, suffering arises, all in a fraction of a second, so fast you don't even see the steps. But when you slow down and bring awareness to each step, you create space. You see that anxiety is just a sensation, resistance is a choice, and suffering is optional. That doesn't mean the anxiety disappears immediately, remember. We're not trying to make it disappear, but it does mean you stop being controlled by it. You stop organizing your entire life around avoiding this feeling. You stop turning down opportunities, avoiding situations, limiting your life, all because you're trying to not feel anxious. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Buddha taught that there are three characteristics of all experience. The first is impermanence, everything changes. The second is unsatisfactoriness. Nothing provides permanent satisfaction. And the third is non-self. There's no fixed permanent self having the experience. When you apply these three insights to anxiety, everything shifts. If anxiety is impermanent, then you don't need to be so afraid of it, because you know it will change. You've had anxiety before and it passed, you'll have it again and it will pass again. It's a weather pattern moving through, not a permanent state. If anxiety is unsatisfactory, but all experiences are unsatisfactory, then you can stop expecting to reach some permanent state of calm and instead learn to relate wisely to whatever arises. And if there's no fixed self, then you can stop identifying as an anxious person and see instead that anxiety is just an experience happening, not who you are. This last point is crucial and often misunderstood. When the Buddha taught non-self, he wasn't saying you don't exist. He was saying that the self you think you are, this solid, unchanging entity, is actually a process, a flow, a constantly changing stream of experiences. You're not an anxious person having calm moments. You're not a calm person being invaded by anxiety. You're a process that sometimes includes anxiety and sometimes doesn't. This might sound like semantics, but it's actually liberating. If you identify as an anxious person, then anxiety becomes part of your identity, something you have to defend and maintain and live up to. But if you see anxiety as just one experience among many, arising and passing based on conditions, then you don't have to carry it as a burden of identity. Let me tell you what happened in that grocery store parking lot. After sitting with my panic for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I remembered something I had read about the Buddhist approach. Instead of trying to make the panic stop, I turned toward it. I said to myself, "Okay, this is panic. These are the sensations of panic. My heart is racing, that's what hearts do during panic. My thoughts are catastrophizing, that's what thoughts do during panic." And I just sat there feeling it all, watching it all, not trying to change it or fix it or make it go away. And something remarkable happened. The panic didn't immediately disappear, but the suffering around the panic began to dissolve. I was still having all the physical sensations, but I wasn't adding the layer of, "This is terrible, something is wrong with me, I need to make this stop." And without that layer, the experience, while still uncomfortable, was manageable. It was just sensation, just experience, just life happening. Over the next few weeks and months, I continued practicing this approach, not just with panic, but with all forms of anxiety. When I felt anxious about a work deadline, instead of spiraling into worry, I would pause and feel where the anxiety was in my body, what it felt like, what thoughts accompanied it. I would acknowledge it, allow it, and then gently return my attention to what was actually in front of me. When I felt anxious about a social situation, instead of rehearsing conversations or imagining disasters, I would notice the anxiety, observe it with curiosity, and then engage with the present moment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my relationship with anxiety changed. I stopped seeing it as an enemy to be defeated and started seeing it as information from my nervous system, sometimes useful, sometimes just noise, but never something that needed to control my life. The Buddha called this the middle way, not suppressing your feelings but not being controlled by them either, not seeking to eliminate anxiety but not feeding it with resistance, not forcing yourself to accept what you can't accept, but not clinging to your non-acceptance either. It's a subtle balance, a dance, a constant practice of meeting your experience with wisdom and compassion rather than with grasping and aversion. Now, I want to address something that might be coming up for you. You might be thinking, this sounds great in theory, but what about real anxiety disorders? What about panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, OCD, all the clinical conditions that have been studied and diagnosed and treated? Is Buddhism saying those aren't real, that people just need to accept their way out of serious mental health conditions? Absolutely not, and this is a crucial distinction. The Buddha was describing universal patterns of human suffering, not claiming that biological factors, trauma, neurochemistry, and life circumstances don't matter. Modern Buddhism-inspired therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and dialectical behavior therapy have been extensively researched and shown to be effective for clinical anxiety, often as effective as medication and sometimes with more lasting results. But these therapies don't work by making anxiety go away. They work by changing your relationship to anxiety, exactly as the Buddha taught. In acceptance and commitment therapy, for instance, you learn to hold your anxious thoughts lightly, to see them as just mental events rather than truths you must believe or problems you must solve. You learn to take action based on your values, even when anxiety is present, rather than waiting for the anxiety to disappear before you live your life. This is the practical application of the Buddhist insight that suffering comes from our clinging and resistance, not from the pain itself. There's also growing neuroscience research that supports the Buddhist understanding of anxiety. Scientists have found that when you practice mindfulness, when you observe your thoughts and feelings without judgment, you're actually strengthening the prefrontal cortex and reducing activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. You're literally rewiring your brain to respond to stress differently. You're building what researchers call psychological flexibility, the ability to experience difficult thoughts and feelings without being controlled by them. The Buddha didn't have brain scans, but he understood through direct observation what scientists are now confirming, that how you relate to your experience changes the structure and function of your mind. One of the most profound aspects of the Buddhist teaching on anxiety is the emphasis on compassion, particularly self-compassion. In Western culture, we often respond to our anxiety with judgment and self-criticism. We tell ourselves we should be stronger, we shouldn't feel this way, there's something wrong with us for struggling. The Buddha would say, this self-judgment is another form of clinging, specifically clinging to the idea of who you should be, rather than accepting who you are. And this self-judgment doesn't motivate change, it creates shame, which actually makes anxiety worse. Research in self-compassion has shown that treating yourself with kindness when you're struggling is far more effective for mental health than self-criticism. Imagine if your best friend came to you feeling anxious and overwhelmed. Would you say, "What's wrong with you? You should be over this by now. Just stop feeling this way"? Of course not. You would probably say something like, "I can see you're really struggling right now. This is hard. How can I support you?" The Buddhist practice of self-compassion means talking to yourself the way you would talk to someone you care about, recognizing that suffering is part of the human experience, that you're not alone in feeling this way, and that you deserve kindness, especially when you're struggling. The real cause of your anxiety, according to this Buddhist insight, isn't your job, your relationships, your health, or the state of the world. It's the clinging and resistance, the grasping and pushing away, the constant demand that your experience be different than it is. And the freedom you're seeking isn't found in finally eliminating anxiety. It's found in changing your relationship to it, in letting it arise and pass without it controlling your life, in meeting it with wisdom and compassion rather than fear and resistance. This is the path the Buddha discovered 2,500 years ago, and it's as relevant today as it was then. Not because it's religious or mystical, but because it's true, because it describes how your mind actually works. And because when you align your understanding and your actions with this truth, suffering begins to dissolve, not through fighting, but through seeing clearly and letting go.